What happened that weekend lived far beyond the physical aftermath. The staged photo in life, the exaggerated headlines, and the Hollywood portrayal turned a local gathering into a national myth. That myth inspired decades of cultural representation, from small clubhouses to global outlaw brands like the Hells Angels. The truth of the weekend was relatively tame, but the legend? That became timeless. Why Hollister still resonates. The Hollister story endures because it shows how powerful perception can be. A single staged photograph and a few sensational headlines were enough to create a stereotype that has lasted for generations. It also captured a specific moment in post-war America, one of restless veterans, small-town tension, and a national media hungry for spectacle. At its core, Hollister represents the clash between youthful freedom and public fear. For the bikers, it was just a party. For the townspeople, it felt like an invasion. That conflict between fun and fear, freedom and control, became the foundation of the outlaw biker myth. A story that still plays out today, every time the rumble of motorcycles rolls into a quiet town. In the end, Hollister was a wild but largely harmless weekend, yet it became legend. The so-called riot gave birth to the modern image of the outlaw biker, not because of what actually happened, but because of how it was told. It's a reminder that sometimes it's not the facts that shape history, but the stories we choose to believe. Though critics were divided, the movie resonated with young audiences and alarmed many parents. Almost overnight, the image of the outlaw biker was cemented in American culture. The one-percenter myth. Among the most enduring legacies of the Hollister event is the idea of the one-percenter, a term that still defines biker subculture today. According to popular legend, the American Motorcyclist Association, AMA, in response to the negative press from Hollister, declared that 99% of riders were law-abiding, implying that the remaining 1% were outlaws. That statement gave birth to the rebellious one-percenter label, which many outlaw motorcycle clubs proudly adopted. But there's a problem. No such statement can be found in AMA archives. Researchers and historians have searched extensively and found no official press release, statement, or document confirming the now famous 99% claim. Even the AMA itself has publicly stated multiple times that it never issued such a declaration. Most likely, the quote was invented later, possibly by journalists looking for a memorable phrase, or by bikers creating an origin myth for their rebellious identity. Some scholars believe the idea may have originated in reader letters published in response to Life's coverage of Hollister, where the notion that only a small percentage caused trouble was mentioned. Over time, this sentiment may have been reinterpreted and falsely attributed to the AMA. Regardless of its origins, outlaw clubs embraced the label almost immediately. What was intended as criticism became a badge of pride. Diamond-shaped 1% patches began appearing on motorcycle vests worn by those who identified as outside mainstream society. Being a one-percenter wasn't just about riding hard or partying. It represented a deliberate rejection of conventional values and a commitment to a life rooted in brotherhood, rebellion, and often confrontation. Civic reaction and policing, the biker image. After the bikers left Hollister, the town was rattled, but not destroyed. Streets were littered, some windows were broken, and tensions were high. Yet the physical damage was minimal. Still, the feeling of having lost control to outsiders left a lasting impression on local officials. National press coverage amplified that impression. Police departments across the country took notice, using Hollister as a cautionary example. Though no one had died and the violence was limited, the story fed the belief that motorcycle rallies were inherently dangerous. The AMA, embarrassed by the press attention, adjusted its strategy. Gypsy tours, once promoted as lively, family-friendly events, were rebranded with an even stronger focus on safety and organization. Races, hill climbs, and official contests became central, while the party atmosphere was downplayed. Local governments followed suit. Towns that had previously welcomed bikers for the tourism revenue began tightening regulations, imposing curfews, requiring permits, and restricting alcohol sales during rallies. Some places even attempted to ban biker events entirely. No one wanted to be the next Hollister. In the end, it wasn't the broken glass or minor property damage that defined Hollister. It was the perception that a small town had been overrun, its law enforcement powerless, and its public order shaken. That perception shaped national policy and local attitudes toward biker events for years to come. Hollister's evolving legacy. In the years following 1947, Hollister tried to distance itself from the infamous rally. For decades, town officials and residents rarely spoke about the so-called riot. Hollister wanted to be known as a quiet agricultural community, not a symbol of chaos. But by the 1990s, public attitudes shifted. Motorcycle culture had gone mainstream, and Hollister's place in that story was undeniable. Instead of hiding from the legend, the town began to embrace it. In 1997, to mark the 50th anniversary of the original event, Hollister hosted a massive commemorative rally. Tens of thousands of riders filled the same streets that had once made national headlines. Since then, the Independence Rally has become a recurring celebration, blending history with modern biker culture. Today, Hollister occupies a unique space, both a quiet farming town and a landmark in motorcycle history. How one weekend changed the world. Hollister didn't create the outlaw biker, but it gave the image a national spotlight. Before 1947, motorcycle clubs were mostly local groups. Veterans and thrill seekers who gathered for racing, drinking, and camaraderie. After Hollister, that subculture became a symbol of rebellion, cast in the public imagination as unpredictable and defiant. The famous photo. If the weekend had ended quietly, Hollister's wild 4th of July might have become a local story and nothing more. But Life magazine had sent photographer Barney Peterson to cover the event. Among the many photos he took, one stood out. It showed a man named Eddie Davenport slumped on a Harley-Davidson with a cigarette hanging from his mouth, beer bottles scattered around the bike. The image screamed recklessness and disorder. But according to eyewitnesses, the scene was staged. The bottles were placed intentionally to make the shot more dramatic. Davenport wasn't a notorious troublemaker. He was asked to pose for the picture. Still, the image worked. It captured exactly what the media wanted, a symbol of chaos. When the Life spread was published, headlines followed. Bikers terrorize town. Pandemonium in Hollister. Readers across the country believed Hollister had been overrun by dangerous gangs. The story took on a life of its own. Myth versus reality. In truth, the event wasn't a riot. There were no deaths, no buildings were burned. No one was seriously injured beyond the usual scrapes and broken bones. About 50 arrests were made, almost all for drunkenness or disorderly conduct. But the image and the media spin told a different story, one that stuck. The American Motorcyclist Association, embarrassed by the coverage, quickly distanced itself from the rally. The event had been meant to promote motorcycling as a respectable hobby. Now it was being linked to lawlessness and rebellion. The aftermath and the legacy Hollywood took notice. In 1953, The Wild One, starring Marlon Brando, brought the outlaw biker image to movie screens nationwide, inspired directly by the Hollister event. That film, and others like it, shaped the public's view of motorcycle clubs for decades. The legend of Hollister also gave birth to the now famous one-percenter term. based on the possibly apocryphal claim that 99% of motorcyclists were law-abiding and only 1% caused trouble. Some clubs later embraced that label as a badge of honor. Over time, Hollister came to accept its role in this history. Today, the town hosts biker events that commemorate the 1947 rally, not as a riot, but as the birthplace of a cultural identity. Conclusion: the 1947 Hollister rally was loud, crowded, and disorderly, but it was not the violent riot many newspapers described. It was a moment where veterans, motorcycles, and media collided. The result was a myth that reshaped public perception of motorcyclists for generations. The real story is more complex, a mix of post-war freedom, cultural misunderstanding, and media sensationalism. But that single weekend, captured in one unforgettable photograph, helped create the modern image of the outlaw biker, whether real or not. One wild weekend in 1947 changed everything. Officials tried to clarify that most motorcyclists were law-abiding citizens, eager to distinguish the average rider from the now infamous figures featured in Life magazine. But the damage was already done. Out of the gap between reality and media portrayal, the outlaw biker image was born. Hollister wasn't the first time bikers had thrown a rowdy party, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But it was the moment when a national audience began to view motorcyclists not just as hobbyists, but as outsiders, rebels, and even threats. The outlaw image didn't emerge from what happened, but from how it was framed. From sensational headlines to Hollywood, the Hollister weekend would have faded into obscurity if it had stayed in the newspapers. Instead, it took on a second life. From real life to fiction. In 1951, Frank Rooney published a short story in Harper's Magazine titled Cyclists' Raid. The plot was a thinly veiled retelling of the Hollister incident, a small town overwhelmed by a flood of bikers, helpless law enforcement, and terrified residents. Rooney borrowed heavily from the media coverage of Hollister, echoing the same language and imagery that had fueled national headlines. Hollywood saw potential. Columbia Pictures quickly adapted the story into a film, The Wild One, released in 1953. Marlon Brando starred as Johnny Strabler, the brooding leader of the Black Rebels Motorcycle Club, with Lee Marvin playing the rival gang leader, Chino. The film followed the exaggerated narrative. Rebellious bikers storm a quiet town, clash with locals, and expose a deep cultural divide between tradition and rebellion. What made the film iconic wasn't just the plot, it was Brando himself. Dressed in a leather jacket and tilted cap, he embodied a new kind of American rebel, quiet, unpredictable, and dangerous. One line from the film became legendary. A local girl asks, "What are you rebelling against?" Brando's character replies, "What do you got?" That exchange perfectly captured the emerging outlaw biker image, not as a veteran on a Harley, but as a symbol of defiance against authority and convention. In the summer of 1947, Hollister, California, a quiet farming town with a population of just 4,500, was about to be changed forever. Over the 4th of July weekend, thousands of motorcycles roared into town. Many were ridden by World War II veterans on surplus Harley-Davidsons. What began as a simple motorcycle rally quickly spiraled into an event that captured national attention. Newspapers shouted riot and terror in the streets. But the most powerful weapon wasn't a fist or a bottle. It was a photograph. One staged image showing a drunken rider surrounded by empty beer bottles was published in Life magazine and seen by millions. That single image helped invent the American myth of the outlaw biker. But how much of it was real, and how much was exaggerated or misunderstood? What this story covers. In this video or article, we'll walk through the full timeline of the 1947 Hollister Gypsy Tour, an event that drew far more riders than organizers ever anticipated. We'll explore the world these bikers came from, veterans seeking speed, freedom, and camaraderie in post-war America. We'll examine how a weekend of rowdy behavior became a national scandal once the media picked up the story. We'll also explore how one photograph became an enduring cultural symbol and how Hollywood ran with the image, leading to films like The Wild One. We'll look at how the American Motorcyclist Association, AMA, responded, how the one percenter identity was born, and how Hollister eventually embraced the legend as part of its own history. All information here comes from original sources, including Life, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Los Angeles Times, Time, academic journals on motorcycle history, and city records from Hollister itself. Post-war America and the rise of motorcycle culture. When World War II ended, millions of American servicemen returned home with mechanical skills, adrenaline-fueled memories, and a desire for freedom. Many had spent years working on military motorcycles and vehicles. Civilian life felt slow by comparison. Motorcycles filled that gap. Army surplus bikes, especially Harley-Davidsons, flooded the market. They were affordable, fast, and easily modified. For many veterans, motorcycles offered more than transportation. They were a way to hold on to the sense of excitement and brotherhood they'd experienced in the military. Out of this grew a new social scene. Veterans formed clubs, traveled together, and built communities centered around the road. These weren't gangs in the criminal sense. They were social groups that drank together, rode together, and sought escape from the ordinary. But when hundreds of loud motorcycles arrived in a small town, their presence was impossible to ignore. To guide this growing culture, the AMA organized events called gypsy tours, official rallies meant to present motorcycling in a positive light. In 1947, after a break during the war, the AMA brought the gypsy tour back to Hollister, the town, a quiet agricultural community in San Benito County, welcomed the attention. With a few hotels, bars, and restaurants, they hoped for tourism dollars and a festive weekend. But they weren't prepared for what was coming. When the riders arrived, organizers expected a few hundred riders, perhaps up to 1,000. Instead, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 motorcyclists arrived, nearly doubling the town's population overnight. The bikers came from all over California and beyond. Notable among them was the Booze Fighters Motorcycle Club, founded by World War II veterans in Los Angeles and known for its hard partying reputation. They were joined by the Pissed Off Bastards of Bloomington, a group that would eventually help form the Hells Angels, the Market Street Commandos from San Francisco, and dozens of smaller clubs and solo riders. Hollister's infrastructure couldn't keep up. Hotels filled immediately. Riders slept on sidewalks, in backyards, and in doorways. Lawns became campsites. To townspeople, it looked like chaos. To the riders, it was just part of the experience. Over the weekend, motorcycles raced up and down Main Street. Engines roared. Stunts were performed in the streets. Crowds gathered. Bars overflowed. Alcohol flowed freely. Some bikers passed bottles between moving motorcycles. Others showed off their riding skills, revving engines and popping wheelies for the crowd. The police, just 7 officers in the Hollister department, were quickly overwhelmed. Even with support from the California Highway Patrol, there were simply too many people. They made arrests for public drunkenness and reckless behavior, but for every biker hauled off, many more took their place. There were fights, mostly minor, and hospitals treated dozens for injuries, mostly broken bones and cuts. But the event, while loud and wild, wasn't the violent riot later headlines would claim.